3, 2, 1.
Television news is a relentless business. Every minute of every day is a live news opportunity. And every word is scrutinised for the meaning behind the message. The 24-hour news cycle, it seems, is here to stay.
There will be a ballot.
It's here in the corridors of power, where politics and journalism meet, that television has found its place in democracy.
The ABC's Canberra news editor, Jack Commons, says the government has been defeated.
It's been a long and colourful journey, through social change, shock events, powerful personalities, and the most popular consumer technology the world has ever known. In this hour, we'll take you back to television's early days.
It's been a bad week in South Vietnam for everybody.
Behind the walls of Parliament House, with ABC reporters and the political players on the field of politics.
There was a right way to get to Australia and a wrong way, and this was not the right way to do it.
Everyone in the Prime Minister's office was watching the ABC News because it was obvious what was coming.
Can you expect people to believe that you didn't know that that meeting was going to take place?
I can expect people to believe that you are a damned impertinence.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
To retrace some of the social movements and sudden shocks that changed media, politics and Australia forever.
A little over 2 hours after the first terrorist attack in New York.
There was no way known John Howard or the Australian people were going to say, look, let's just move on, it was dreadful.
That was frightening, and the images were horrible.
There's a danger in getting sucked into the whole media blitz.
To tell the stories behind the stories and ask, has television changed politics? How does politics manage its message? Who charts the course of history? And in the end, who makes the news?
Well, may we say, God save the Queen.
National media have a responsibility.
Travis Dow could lead the Labor Party to victory.
I have no blood on my hands.
We committed the murder.
Talk to you about their...
Gillard came to see me.
It was the 60s, and Australia's youth culture was booming. Technology was revolutionising our lives, and television had come to town.
I hope you're going to have a ball this afternoon.
It was the new media of its day, promising to change the way we saw the world and the way it worked. It didn't take long.
It's been a bad week in South Vietnam for everybody. Nearly 200 American Marines dead and more than 700 wounded.
Bien Hoa still gets mortared occasionally, and the communists still retain a powerful capacity to strike anywhere in the country.
These are the images that began flickering across the television screens of Australian homes in the mid to late 60s. It was the first television war Australians had known, and journalists were still honing their craft. What they knew was the unforgiving truth of the visual image. What they didn't was that it would contribute to a wave of public discontent that took protest to the streets. This was the decade of change wrought by the power of the people.
Looking back on Vietnam and knowing that it was a very unpopular war, I mean, that's the impression it was. But it's hard for them to understand that when we first sent the first Australian troops to Vietnam, it was a very popular war.
Tell me, what do you think about sending troops to Vietnam?
Oh, I think it's a good idea. I think all countries should participate and help each other like that. Well, if it's going to protect Australia, I think it's worthwhile.
I think it's got to be done. I haven't got any choice at this stage.
But as the mood of the nation shifted, television was struggling with its own newfound power, and broadcasters were reluctant to adopt new ways of preparing and presenting news.
It's amazing when I look back on it, but the news department, the ABC news department in those days, were basically newspaper men, and they produced bulletins which were read by an announcer. They thought the tape recorder was an instrument of the devil.
The result? A news bulletin more closely akin to radio than television's cinematic predecessor, the newsreel.
Good evening, this is James Dibble in Sydney with the national news. Dominating the world scene today, President Johnson's two important announcements. Rod McNeil has the story on his statement regarding the presidency.
World leaders are studying the implications.
Broadcasters like the ABC made a distinction between news and current affairs. Four Corners established itself as a weekly offering during the 60s. But nightly current affairs, now that was where the action was.
This Day Tonight was a very unusual program. And the ABC at that time was very conservative, and the people who put This Day Tonight together wanted to break the mold.
Did you watch our new show last night?
No, what time was it?
7:30.
No, I was watching the black and white minstrel show.
No, I wasn't watching it, but if it was anything like Four Corners, I think it should be very good.
I mean, I think the basic tenet of journalism should be, and particularly television journalism, thou shalt not bore. Well, TDT didn't.
TDT was determined to break new ground, experimenting with satire to interpret news events.
Sketches and humour were brought into a current affairs program. I mean, when LBJ famously rode with Robert Askin in the parade and some protesters got down, lay down in front of the car, I think it was Askin suggested to his driver that he run the bastards over, or words to that effect. And so TDT did a little stand-up scat chorus with run, run, run the bastards over.
Run, run, run the bastards over. Run, run, run the bastards over. As I said to LBJ.
But it was also constrained by a distrustful management and a bureaucratic set of policies, including a rule that hampered its ability to report politics.
It was called the balance rule. If somebody was going to criticize the government, you could not use that story unless you had a government minister or a government spokesman on to answer it, right? Well, the obvious catch-22 in that is the minister just did not appear. And if the minister did not appear, then the story just couldn't get to air. And we took it upon ourselves to break that rule. We would have a chair, an empty chair in the studio, and we would say, so-and-so has criticized the government over so-and-so. We asked the minister to appear. This is where he would have sat if he had come, but he didn't. So we put pressure on.
It blazed some trails and it set standards, and Australians, I think, developed an interest in current affairs that has stayed.
Inevitably, the politics of war and peace became a focus of This Day Tonight's cameras as resistance to Australia's role in Vietnam began to spread.
A lot of people felt that it simply was wrong to be there, we shouldn't be there, we shouldn't be conscripting our young men to go there. And of course there was that obscene lottery called the lottery of death. Numbers were drawn out of an actual lottery barrel. And if a particular birth date came up, well, people with that birth date were selected and off they went.
Suddenly, Pimble mothers and Turak mothers were taking to the streets to demonstrate. So it wasn't just the commies and the ratbags and the students who were doing it. It was a universal thing. And of course, later on, there were these moratorium marches and where hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. But This Day Tonight had a lot to do with this sense of freedom that people were feeling.
You can see one or two fine examples of the shock troops of the new left, members of the veterans of the old left. And right behind me here, a lot of people who've never demonstrated before.
If I were to credit This Day Tonight with one accomplishment, it was the change that it brought about in a period of change because the Australian society was ready for change. And I think This Day Tonight helped that along by making people start to understand all the things that needed accomplishment in a country that was still doing very well. I'm not saying that This Day Tonight changed the politics of the country because it was going to change anyway. But it opened people's minds to subjects they hadn't thought about, and that was very important. So you'd say that it was a catalyst for change.
By the early 70s, Political strategists had grasped the mood for change and understood the power of the small screen to influence the voting public. It was time to apply the lessons of marketing to politics.
Look, from the early 70s right through to now, but starting in the early 70s, the power of television advertising and the power of politicians being able to crystallise a message and just bring a big idea back to one simple proposition that could be explained on television.
Labor was ahead of the game at that time on that issue. Gough played with his image, the hair was fluffed and all the rest of it, and a lot of the things around that campaign in '72 were the razzle-dazzle. That was the first Australian campaign to go down the road of the American razzle-dazzle style.
It was time. We'd gone through a period of long coalition governments, and he was a Labor leader, big, tall, good-looking man. Captured the mood of a nation. It was very clever, and clearly it was time.
Authorised M. Young, Ainsley Avenue, Canberra, for the Australian Labor Party.
Gough and his advisors and Labor's advertising agency and their strategists all understood the importance of television. The irony of that is that Gough Whitlam himself identified himself as much more a figure of the print era. He used to describe himself as a Caxton man.
In those days, the power was always with the press, a little bit with radio, but the real power were the print journos.
When I came here in the 70s, the newspapers were dominant, but television had arrived and television was starting to spread its influence. Whitlam and Fraser were big men, good-looking men, strong, if you like, men. They were good television materials. Fraser struggled a little bit, but Whitlam clearly enjoyed it. So I think television suited the times in the sense that these people knew how to use it. And they used it very, very effectively.
The new government had much to do and did not delay. The despised practice of conscription was immediately shut down, and reform swept through family law, education, health, infrastructure, the arts and trade. The pace was frenetic.
The government was rolling out policy changes day in and day out. There was so much happening, it was very difficult to keep up with it. So you were running from the moment you got here until the moment you left. It was exciting, but it was exhausting.
The 23 years that Labor were out of power was almost my whole lifetime at that point. So there was a massive expectation. There was immense drama just around Labor getting to power.
It took us quite a while to sort of settle down and realise that perhaps we needed to start looking beyond the announcements when things started to fracture. But this was a very exciting and journalistically terrific time to be here.
In the wake of Whitlam's reforms and the government's misadventure, the press gallery found itself tracking an intense Senate standoff. An opposition leader determined to stake his place in history.
Is your stand still firm about blocking supply? Of course it is.
And ultimately, a political crisis that shocked the nation.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
I had no sense that the Governor-General would sack an elected Prime Minister. Right up until the moment the announcement came when we were having lunch and the press boxes rang and it was an announcement from the Governor-General to say that he'd terminated Whitlam.
You can't help but wonder how the dismissal would be covered today compared to then. We were working for a weekly program, obviously, at that time, and those pictures certainly would have been conveyed that night on This Day Tonight and on the news. But in today's terms, of course, you would have had minute-by-minute descriptions of everything, and in fact, one wonders. We've discovered subsequently that when Gough Whitlam went out to Government House, unknown to him, to be dismissed, he didn't know, and nobody else knew, apart from Sir John Kerr and Malcolm Fraser, that Malcolm Fraser was parked round the back. Well, there would have been television crews planted out at the Yarralumla gates
who would have seen the comings and goings, and quite possibly they would have been live crossed around the nation as they were happening. And all of those moments on the steps and the crowds and the movements toing and froing of the leaders and so on, that would have all been live. That would have all been live. Now, would that have made a difference? Chances are it might have. What sort of a difference, I don't know.
On the morning of February the 2nd, 1983, Malcolm Fraser, having won 3 consecutive elections, was facing media speculation about the timing of a fourth.
The national media have a responsibility to allow the issues to be debated and not their own predilections. But no, I hope nobody will be reading into that, because I'm still looking to see whether we can run an election to 1984.
The next day, Australian politics took a dramatic turn. Parliament was yet to meet for the year, and the Labor Party had scheduled what seemed a routine executive meeting in Brisbane. The media was there to cover its decisions.
We were there because at that stage there was so much speculation about the leadership that you couldn't afford to have the Labor Party meet at that level without a journalist being present. As it turned out, it was probably, apart from the dismissal, the most memorable and most dramatic day in Australian politics.
In those days there was an election, a by-election in Flinders, and a young Peter Reith stood and he won. And instead of a huge swing against the government that everyone expected, there was a tiny swing and Peter Reith won. And on the strength of it, Malcolm Fraser said, I want to have an early election.
In Brisbane, the Labor Party machine was plotting its course for the next election. Hayden had lost the last to Fraser, and former ACTU President Bob Hawke had already lost a challenge against Bill Hayden. As if controlled by some grand puppeteer, the unfolding of events seemed orchestrated for high drama.
It wasn't until around 12:20 that the decision was formally taken that Bill Hayden should step aside and that Bob Hawke should become leader, and then a news conference was arranged for about 1:25. Now, of course, when you look at that time frame, that coincides very neatly with what was going on back in Canberra.
The Prime Minister moved early here in Canberra today to bring on the early election. By mid-morning, he had informed Liberal Party officials interstate, but it wasn't until just after midday that he made the trip to the official residence of the Governor-General, Sir Ninian Stephen. But Sir Ninian was entertaining a party of Polish diplomats to lunch. Mr. Fraser had to be content with leaving a letter and having a brief chat.
I think the remarkable thing about it from a journalist's point of view and from the point of view of the politicians involved is that everything was happening in isolation. One side had no idea what the other side was doing. It was before social media, it was even before mobile phones, and so therefore there was no way of communicating, there was no way of keeping in touch with what was going on.
Inside the office behind me here, the Labor Shadow Cabinet is meeting. Bill Hayden is upstairs on the 12th floor, apparently conferring with his advisors. Bob Hawke is behind me here now, and any moment we're expecting either one or two of those men to come down and talk to the media.
It wasn't until the formal news conference was called at 1:20, 1:25 I think it was that day, that we had confirmation that Bill Hayden was going and Bob Hawke was the new leader.
Mr. Hayden put on a brave face for the media when the meeting began, but by mid-morning he had decided to avoid a bloody party room battle and resign almost immediately.
I want to say this, I am not convinced that the Labor Party would not win under my leadership. I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory, the way the country is and the way the opinion polls are showing up for the Labor Party.
The media took a far more interest in Bob Hawke than they did in Bill Hayden. One, because they knew he was a more interesting character and was capable of giving them a better grab, but also because they suddenly knew there was a contest, a real contest was on, and there was a change of government in prospect, and that will draw the media any time.
And therefore, I've recommended to His Excellency that there should be a double dissolution of the Parliament. That has been agreed. The election will be on the 5th of March.
And so the press conference was over, almost. There was one last question.
Mr. Fraser, did you have any second thoughts this afternoon when you found out that you would like to face Mr. Hawke and not Mr. Hayden?
On contrary, I had a little more relish. It'll be the first election in which two Labor leaders have been knocked off in one go.
Fraser turned up at Government House without any sense
that there might be leadership change in the Labor Party. In fact, he turned up at Government House simply to exploit what he thought was the situation. He wanted to run against Bill Hayden, and he wanted to run against Hayden, one, because he figured he could beat him, and two, because he thought Bill Hayden had been damaged by leadership, and he didn't want the more popular Bob Hawke to have time to take over the leadership. So he turned up at Government House in total ignorance of what was going on. Likewise, the Labor Party took the decision in total ignorance of what Malcolm Fraser was up to.
And so the stage was set. The man who had led the charge against the Labor giant Gough Whitlam and had already defeated Bill Hayden at one election suddenly found himself in a completely different contest. Television was shaping what it meant to be a politician. And Australia's first celebrity leader was made for the moment.
He was quite a threatening and intimidating figure, this guy with the sort of, with the raised eyebrows and the scowl. It was a kind of sport for him to pull journalists apart.
That night, Bob Hawke held his first television interview as Labor leader and took his abrasive approach to journalists to new heights in an interview that's become part of Australian television folklore.
Good evening and welcome to Nationwide 1983, which tonight covers the political turmoil that's dominated the nation. Richard Carlton.
To Brisbane and Mr. Bob Hawke. Mr. Hawke, could I ask you whether you feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands?
You're not improving, are you? I thought you'd make a better start to the year than that. It's a ridiculous question. You know it's ridiculous. I have no blood on my hands. I was not involved in the discussions that Bill Hayden's fellow leaders had with him. I hope the standard of your questioning improves.
He called Richard Carlton a damned impertinence, and when you think it through, this concept that he had blood in his hands, well, of course he did.
Now, can you expect people to believe that you didn't know that meeting was going to take place?
I can expect people to believe that you are a damned impertinence, Mr. Carlton. I had no knowledge of any meeting this morning. He and his supporters were gathering numbers and undermining Bill Hayden. It's an historical fact. And so Richard Carlton's question wasn't unreasonable, and it drew quite a response. He was making his decision. Now, Mr. Carlton, you can sit there with your silly quizzical face. You've got a reputation right around this country. Yeah, it's looking better still. You've got a reputation for your impertinence.
The response to Hawke's performance from the advisors around him was immediate. They said they never wanted to see the likes of that again. And it was probably beneficial to that extent that it came early and that they were able to see it and then pull it up because it was too strong, way too strong.
Part of what Hawke had is something that no one's ever quite been able to explain, and that was the sort of magic connection that he had with the Australian people. There was also a kind of magnetic aspect to his personality, and he revelled in it. He loved that. He loved that, playing to that relationship.
I have no doubt in my mind that from the moment that they learnt that the Labor Party had changed leaders, they knew they'd been snookered. Malcolm Fraser knew that, his strategists knew that, his ministers knew that, because their whole plan was to go early so that they would run against Bill Hayden.
We had this wonderful, wonderful commercial that was never produced or never saw the light of day. And it was Bill Hayden in those days, before you could do clever things on television. And it was Bill Hayden's head on a chook, flapping around in the chook yard and saying, look, do you really want this person to be running the country? And it was a wonderful commercial that got junked. In 24 hours, Bob Hawke took over and just swept everything before him and became the sort of people's darling and had a big election win.
Hawke did go on to win that 1983 election, and the next three, in 84, 87 and 90. And it was during the Hawke years that the government, the opposition and the media faced a sudden jolt in their relationship, driven not by policy, technology or public sentiment, but by architecture.
Hello, how are you? Thank you very much. Good morning, good morning.
What do you make of the national...
Every morning outside the present Parliament House, the doorstop patrol waits to harvest the politicians' daily crop of grab-speak.
In old Parliament House, the journalists and the politicians lived in each other's pockets. I remember Mick Young saying that you couldn't leave a cabinet meeting and go to the toilet without bumping into a journalist. That was the nature of the building.
Then, of course, there's the ultra-salubrious ABC Bureau, which was designed by the same people who thought up the idea of battery chooks for the poultry industry. To give you an idea of the layout, this is radio current affairs over here. Radio Australia here, television current affairs here, down in this corner television news, and along here radio news.
There was a wonderful, rich feeling about that old Parliament. There was a sense of history about it. There was a sense that you could bump into anybody in King's Hall in the old Parliament and have a chat.
You could see politics, you could smell politics, you could feel politics in this building. There was no running away from it.
Just south of the cramped quarters of the old Parliament, the landscape of the nation's capital was being transformed, promising relief from the difficult working conditions of its predecessor, and raising questions about how the media and politics would work in the new environs.
The question, I think, is, do politicians want to ignore the media, or more to the point, do they want the media to ignore them? And of course the answer is no.
Television comes first. Can't see me on tape.
Hey. The premise of your question is wrong, so you're going to be in trouble.
And how will you feel, you've worked here for quite a while, how will you feel personally about leaving the old press gallery?
Delighted, can't wait.
But despite the plush new surroundings, the new building changed the dynamic between politics and the media.
In the new Parliament House, of course, it was segregated and politicians were suddenly locked behind secure doors. And so for a long time, I think that broke down the access and it became a bit of a problem.
The Polly's Palace, as some call it.
If you were a Prime Minister holding a government together that was a bit of a leaky boat, you'd have preferred the new Parliament. Or if you had things to hide, you'd prefer the new Parliament. If you were a journalist or anyone really who believes in a democracy, a healthy democracy, and where government is as open as it can possibly be, then you'd prefer the old Parliament.
I think you had that period between about 1988 until perhaps 2000, where I don't think it was particularly good for democracy because the two sides, if you like to look at it that way, the media and the politicians, there was quite a gap between them.
So it's funny, but a building can actually change an outcome.
With ABC News.
The 90s arrived as the Australian economy glided in and out of recession. Paul Keating wrestled leadership from the perennial Bob Hawke and against the odds won the 1993 election.
Well, this is the sweetest victory of all.
Keating had a devastating oratory style and used it to humiliate his opponents on the floor of the chamber.
He's going, Mr. Speaker, he's going troppo. He's more to be pitied than despised. He's simply going troppo.
No one could be more devastating in Parliament. I have not seen any other politician use the instrument of Parliament to such profound effect.
Why won't you call an early election?
Order. The answer is, mate, because I want to do you slowly. I know. There's got to be a bit of sport in this for all of us. There's got to be a bit of sport in this for all of us.
But now Parliament was broadcasting live to the nation, and the nation didn't entirely like what it saw.
One of the negatives for Paul Keating, really, once television came to broadcasting Parliament, was those images of Paul Keating, the haranguer. So that gift of the gab that he had, and that potent striking capacity that he had in parliamentary debate, I don't think the images translated in a flattering or positive way for him at large in the electorate.
Every adult in Australia has a view about Paul Keating, and half the people love him and half the people didn't. And as his press secretary going around Australia in taxis and whatever, I rarely said who I worked for because I just wasn't. After a while, you got a little bit tired of the character analysis that they'd give you of Paul Keating.
Prime Minister, thanks for slowing down long enough to speak with one of the faded and jaded players.
Well, that's a pleasure. I mean, if that's how you want to describe yourself.
Well, that's how you described the established media outlets yesterday.
Oh, well, I think they are. There's a fair bit of fade on all of them.
To some extent, I think he'd fallen out of love with the media and out of love with some aspects of public life. He was interested in the big policy picture, as he's famous for, the big picture, and less interested in what he called sometimes the psychobabble of the media. He wasn't so much interested in trying to woo the press anymore. He'd sort of as I say, fallen out of love with them, and I think they sensed that. So there was a bit of dynamic tension there all the time.
The PM imposed rules on camera crews in an attempt to control his image and shunned interviews for set speeches where he could control his message. In December 1992, Keating delivered one of those set speeches. The topic was the International Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples, but over time it's become known simply as the Redfern speech.
Paul Keating says Australia has so far failed as the land of the fair go. The starting point for success is recognising who did the dispossessing.
We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion.
The Prime Minister urged against fear of the Mabo judgment. It recognised for the first time there were people here prior to European settlement.
The Redfern speech was intriguing because I think it is fair to say that outside the Indigenous community, it's remembered more in retrospect than at the time. The Prime Minister also repeated his view that the nation could not really look itself in the face until the descendants of Australia's original inhabitants were compensated for European seizure of their land. And Mabo provided that opportunity.
The thing to look forward to is a country which is in its soul at peace with itself.
Interestingly, in terms of media approach, it was over Mabo in particular that he came to like the idea of an address to the nation.
When the High Court of Australia handed down the Mabo judgment last year, it set our generation of Australians a great challenge.
I think he did one, maybe two addresses to the nation on the subject of Mabo, and this was of course indicative of him thinking that he needed to go not through the media but around the media to get into homes and say, listen, this is what this is about, it's very important.
The truth was native title. The fact that the land had...
hard to believe, but this was long before the days of any form of social media. And so we had opinion polls to guide us on what people thought. We had a little bit of talkback radio, but beyond that, it was quite a different terrain.
Despite the government's big picture agenda, or perhaps because of it, the nation became weary of Labor in power. By contrast, in the final days of the 96 campaign, opposition leader John Howard casually summed up his hopes for Australia with remarkable simplicity.
Can you give us a John Howard vision for the year 2000 to the Australian public such that they will see, yes, this is the person we would like to be Prime Minister?
Let me respond to your question by saying this. By the year 2000, I would like to see an Australian nation that feels comfortable and relaxed about three things.
At the time, it wasn't a rehearsed line or anything. It's just very John Howard, sort of relaxed and comfortable.
I would like to see them comfortable and relaxed about their history. I'd like to see them comfortable and relaxed about the present. And I'd also like to see them comfortable and relaxed about the future.
Certainly as John Howard saw it and the Liberal Party saw it, the period leading up to 96 was a period of conflict and turmoil. Paul Keating had identified some true Labor values and ran hard on those, and John Howard wanted to put that behind the country.
To pick up on those words, comfortable and relaxed, do you think that's a dynamic enough vision to inspire Australians as they move into the next millennium? Is that dynamic enough for Australians?
I think people do want to feel comfortable and relaxed.
They don't want to feel excited?
Well, you can't possibly hope to feel excited about something unless you feel comfortable and familiar with it.
What voters wanted to feel was assured that the stresses and strains of the previous few years would cease and that their daily lives would become, well, perhaps more ordinary.
I think it worked. I really do, because I think there was that sense that the Labor had been in office for too long. They were not comfortable with the Paul Keating style. They saw it as divisive and they saw him as a Labor Party ideologue and not somebody who was governing for the whole country. So undoubtedly John Howard tapped into something there.
If you said to an Australian, honest John wants to make Australia relaxed and comfortable, they'd say, yeah, good, beauty.
It worked. The Coalition and John Howard relished a landslide victory. 2 months later, the new Prime Minister faced the first test of his political will.
With 25 people confirmed dead, it's believed to be the worst mass shooting in Australian history. The nightmare unfolded around 2:30 this afternoon. A lone gunman, armed with a high-powered rifle, entered the Port Arthur historic site and began firing randomly, gunning down tourists and setting...
The Port Arthur massacre that day was just dreadful. You know, many people were saying, well, it's just a tragic event. But it was more than that. There was no way known John Howard or the Australian people were going to say, look, let's just move on, it was dreadful. The minute Port Arthur happened, he came back and he said, I'm going to do something here.
Prime Minister.
The purpose in my speaking tonight is to briefly outline decisions that have been taken by the government in relation to a proposal to be put to the Police Ministers' meeting in Canberra next Friday to significantly strengthen laws relating to gun control in Australia.
All the indications are that John Howard has massive public support for his uncompromising stand on guns, a point he was pressing yet again today.
There's an overwhelming passion almost in the community to have strong, effective national gun laws.
The Prime Minister knew he had public support for gun control, but he had a problem. The states regulated the ownership of firearms, not the federal government in Canberra. And worse still, many inside the coalition were bitterly opposed to any new restrictions on guns.
The National Party, or a significant section of it, was opposed to it. So this was something where John Howard had to take on part of his own constituency to prevail.
People think it must have been an easy decision. It wasn't. It was one of those things where many in the National Party almost walked out of the coalition. The rural Libs versus the city Libs was dreadful.
Cold it may be in Canberra, but Tim Fisher's feeling the heat. His backbench is upset about the Deputy Prime Minister's lack of influence within the Howard government on everything from the impact of spending cuts in the bush to guns.
It was an extraordinarily difficult time. We had protests all around the country. Many people of whom a little time earlier had been handing out how-to-vote cards for John Howard.
And so a campaign of persuasion began.
Today, John Howard hit the airwaves to soothe the concerns of those, notably farmers, who will now have to surrender their guns.
I'm quite determined.
John Howard used morning radio like no other leader has ever used it. You'd run into John Howard when he was in opposition in the press gallery and want to sit down and chat with you about politics and try and persuade you of his position. And he did that with morning radio. And it made him accessible and also gave him a flying start to the day.
From morning radio through to evening television, the Prime Minister was determined and relentless.
We have an opportunity in tragic circumstances to reverse a culture, to change an attitude.
Reaching its climax in an emotionally charged public rally in the Victorian town of Sale, it was here that Australian television captured the remarkable image of a Prime Minister prepared for the worst.
Just as we were getting off the aeroplane, the federal police said to the Prime Minister, look, Prime Minister, we have had a threat on your life, much more serious than we've ever had, ever before. And they said to the PM, you've got to wear this flak jacket if you go out there, otherwise we cannot guarantee your safety. And the PM just said, look, don't be silly, this is Australia, they're Australians. Nothing's going to happen. And I went to the PM and I said, look, I don't understand and I don't have a clue what I would say to your wife, Jeanette, or to the children if we were warned that something was going to happen and we let you go out there unprotected. You're going to hate this, but you should wear that thing for your own safety and for your family's future. He growled and grimaced, and he wore it.
Ladies and gentlemen, is that we believe that it is in the national interest that there be a dramatic reduction in the number of automatic and semi-automatic weapons in the Australian community.
think those who were there were offended by it because they thought, what are you saying to us? Do you think we're dangerous? And so I think he knew that he was going to get that backlash from traditional supporters.
It was one of the few things in John Howard's life that he regrets doing. But at the time, we thought it was a life and death decision. It wasn't.
But we will talk to you about their implementation. We will talk to you about their meaning.
The longer-term takeout was that he was a man of courage, he was a man of conviction. He was prepared to turn up in front of a hostile crowd and argue the point, even though he knew he would never persuade them of it.
In the 3 months since the Port Arthur tragedy, John Howard has worked tirelessly against persistent state opposition and manoeuvring to produce today's victory.
The gun issue was the making of John Howard, undoubtedly, because until that point, he lacked a bit of authority. This issue gave him the authority. It was something that I think the community demanded, and he delivered.
It was a really very, very difficult decision, but one that I think, with hindsight, in the electorate gave John Howard the image of a strong man, a good leader, and a man who was going to do the right thing.
John Howard, the experienced practitioner, had proven his resilience and was rewarded with a second term in office. But after the introduction of the GST, the prospect of a third looked uncertain. By now, political parties were experimenting with sophisticated picture strategies designed specifically for the nightly television news.
If you look back on Howard's 10 years as Prime Minister, almost every image is exactly the same. There's the walking image, there's the radio image, there's the Prime Minister in the Prime Ministerial courtyard image. They were incredibly tight set of images, and that gave this amazing sense of stability to Howard because he seemed to be doing the same thing over and over and over again, and that's not a coincidence. That is the power of pictures in TV to send a subtle, intuitive message.
Labor's media strategy was to lie low, be a small target, and let public discontent with the GST deliver them government. But their confidence was to be short-lived.
Tonight, the MS Tampa remains off the coast of Christmas Island. On board, Australian SAS troops, the Norwegian crew and over 400 asylum seekers.
The images of the Tampa delivered John Howard a powerful television picture to tackle a politically divisive issue, so polarising that the reverberations are still felt today.
There was this looming image of the big red boat off Christmas Island, also the images of all the asylum seekers who have been picked up on the deck.
We were caught on the hop as the media. We hadn't been expecting this. There was no warning that the Australian government was going to move in this direction and was going to start turning back boats, not to mention within days sending out naval ships to do just that.
I was certainly of the view that we had to take strong action on the Tampa to send a signal that there was a right way to get to Australia and a wrong way, and this was not the right way to do it.
Legislation was the Emergency Border Protection Bill, introduced into the House last night to shore up, retrospectively, the government's legal basis for expelling the Norwegian freighter and its human cargo from Australian waters.
And that was a very tough bill. That was basically giving any government of the day the right to treat as it needed to or wanted to any boat coming towards our waters.
What this bill means, and I think the Prime Minister got at it, was that no matter what the circumstances, it will be a reasonable and authoritative thing for an Australian officer to take a boat which is sinking, in which there are life-threatening situations involving the people on board, and order it out.
Kim Beazley looked at it and said, I can't support this, Labor will not support this. I'm sure he knew, and I certainly know all his staff knew at that moment, that this was a turning point in the election campaign, that Labor was going to have trouble holding its support, and the polls changed from that moment.
The time of the Tampa, of course, was the classic wedge. Not since, I think, has a political party been so caught out as the Labor Party was at the time of the Tampa. Literally had half our members disgusted with us for being too hard on asylum seekers, and the other half disgusted with us for being too soft.
Tampa was a massive issue for John Howard, and it worked in his favour. The public was overwhelmingly behind him, and of course the Labor Party was divided. But I think over the years the impact of that has been slightly exaggerated, because something happened 5 or 6 weeks after that, and that was those planes flew into the Twin Towers in New York. And suddenly national security wasn't only a big issue, it was the only issue.
Just A little over 2 hours after the first terrorist attack in New York, the barriers started going up in Canberra. Acting Prime Minister John Anderson activated the National Counter-Terrorism Plan in the middle of the night, declaring an exclusion zone around the US and Israeli embassies, evacuating staff and children.
Look, the Prime Minister was in America when those aeroplanes flew into the World Trade Center. It's not something you'd ever forget.
Because John Howard was in Washington when 9/11 happened, I think he saw firsthand the impact it had on the American psyche. I think he was also very much imbued from early on with this view that we were involved as Western countries, whether we liked it or not, in a war on terror.
These were highly visual events. Live television coverage of the fall of the Twin Towers seared the powerful images into the consciousness of an audience around the world.
That was frightening, and the images were horrible, and in a way they turbocharged what was already happening back in Australia, I think, with the asylum seeker debate. These things, I think these images did work together to create a sense of fear, of alarm, of something very serious happening, and all of that, of course, can't help but work towards, in the interests of the government of the day, especially if that government of the day is seen to be acting with strength.
Well, I think the combination of Tampa and September 11 absolutely blew a torpedo through Labor's chances at that election, and Kim Beazley was well aware of that. He was a notoriously pessimistic person at the best of times. Despite his jovial exterior, he was pretty down about his prospects, but I remember him saying after September 11, the morning of, in Australia, well, there goes the election, and one sense that he was right.
We were then living in a climate, particularly post 9/11, where national security issues began to preoccupy the government, much more so than in its previous 2 terms. And certainly that 3rd term was dominated by the fallout of 9/11, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or then Iraq. And there's no doubt that, and Bali of course happened in that period in 2002. So that was a period where Howard found himself increasingly dealing with international security issues and taking on, I think, a different persona perhaps to the persona he'd had over the last 4 or 5 years as Prime Minister.
John Howard dominated the political landscape until 2007, when Labor offered the electorate a new alternative. Former diplomat and political apparatchik Kevin Rudd beamed a nerdy, folksy enthusiasm at every opportunity. Rudd had embraced television, building a powerfully popular image in all the right places. As Prime Minister, this popularity seemed to secure his place in office. But behind the scenes, staff, bureaucrats, cabinet and party colleagues were growing frustrated, irritated and ultimately enraged by his leadership style. In June 2010, it came to a head.
Obviously there'd been a lot of speculation around, and there was a lot of concern around that something was going on, but my sense was there was perhaps a kind of a slightly more optimistic view on that the day before the final sitting day.
Except that there was a story in the Sydney Morning Herald by Phil Curry that morning saying that some of Kevin's staff had been out canvassing votes amongst the caucus for Kevin. Julia was particularly upset by this. She'd been a very loyal deputy. So what should have been a very normal day started to get quite tense.
It became very clear, by the middle of the day that there was something seriously going on.
So they arranged to meet each other at 7 o'clock. None of this, though, made it to the media.
But in the press gallery, 2 ABC journalists were picking up signals of their own.
These things start so innocuously. There was a coffee between Chris Shulman and a power broker.
In the course of that, and we'd only just started the conversation about nothing in particular, his whole demeanour changed. He leaned into me and said, "Could we win with Julia?" And I said, "I didn't think that was an option anymore." And he jumped up from his seat, said, "Look, thanks for the coffee," which he'd had 2 mouthfuls of, and sped off down the hallway. And I thought, now that is an extremely unusual thing.
Chris and I hit the phones again, another round of phone calls to all the players, the power brokers. No one was willing to say too much, but you could piece together little bit by little bit that something was happening.
About 6:30 in the evening, I received a phone call from Mark Simpkin at the ABC saying that something was up. I necessarily sort of fobbed him off. Chris Uhlmann had the same story, obviously, they were working together. And then my phone started to ring a lot.
When he finally gets onto one of his contacts and starts one of those stupid yes-no things which happens sometimes in journalism.
A rule-in, rule-out game. A yes-no answer was all this person would say. I would ask a question. Is there a move to oust Kevin Rudd? Yes.
So at around about 10 to 7, both he and I believed that we had enough news to break the story, that there was a serious move against Kevin Rudd and it was happening at that very moment.
Literally sprinted up the stairs, bumped literally into Lachlan Harris, the press secretary to Kevin Rudd, who was in the gallery trying to sniff the breeze, find out what was happening.
I did several walks through the gallery that night. It was about basically, you can't go up and say, oh, so have you heard about this story about the Rudd-Gillard thing? You know, so it's a temperature take, they call it.
What's going on? Why are you racing? Oh, you'll have to watch, mate, you'll have to watch.
Everyone in the Prime Minister's office was watching the ABC News because by the time when Mark said that, it was obvious what was coming.
The ABC has learnt that senior ministers and factional power brokers are in talks and counting numbers for a potential move against Kevin Rudd. Here's our chief political correspondent, Mark Simpkin.
The rumblings within the Labor Party are getting louder tonight. Several government sources have told the ABC that MPs are being sounded out about a possible move against the Prime Minister.
There's no kind of surprises when Mark Simpkin broke on 7 p.m. He didn't tell us anything we didn't know. It was probably surprising that it turned up so strongly and so aggressively on the 7 p.m. news.
The meeting started on time at 7 o'clock, and it was the lead story on the ABC that night. So I imagine neither of them have ever seen the yarn.
As the news broke, Kevin Rudd's enemies were scheming. Over dinner, Bill Shorten organised the revolt, just as the challenger tapped the Prime Minister on the shoulder.
Hi folks. Earlier this evening, Julia Gillard came to see me and has requested a ballot for the leadership of the Labor Party. As a result of that request, I will be writing to the Secretary of the Caucus to convene a special meeting of the caucus at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Neither party has ever spoken at any great length about what happened in the meeting, and I certainly never asked. My impression, though, was that it certainly wasn't, no one had made up their mind before the meeting what the outcome of the meeting would be. In fact, in some ways, I wonder whether or not that ABC story didn't influence the events of that night. I mean, once the story was being reported that something, although it was pretty vague, but something was happening, to step back from that would have been difficult. So you do in some ways wonder whether or not the ABC played some part in the events that have unfolded that evening.
In politics, you like to be a reporter of news, but I always feel awkward about influencing news, and this was always going to be a story that was going to very much influence news.
It's not a story anymore, it is part of the story.
I've seen many things written since which say that this was a drop to us. If it was, they did it in the most baroque of ways.
That story was a tool in the leadership challenge. It wasn't a reflection of it wasn't just a reflection of the leadership challenge. And that's not a criticism in any way of Mark, because it's the fact that you're handed the tool and asked to use it is in itself a good story, even though Mark himself is the heart of that story.
Tools, drops, temperature takes, yes-no games. It's a far cry from the early days of television news.
One of the weaknesses, I think, of the communication system we've got now is we know whether parliamentarians and parties are for something or against. We don't get told why anymore.
You get these people that are coming on the whole time, not just journalists talking to journalists, but politicians talking to politicians. And the currency is conflict. The currency of the 24-hour news cycle is conflict.
We have gone back to a point where I think a lot of television coverage is more superficial than ever. And that's a sadness to me, and to me it is the big challenge today of television news.
It's the politicians who are coming up with the lines, who are, I think, dumbing things down, who are simplifying things, and who are in the end getting just too cautious and too fearful to front up to the media, front up to the consumer, and really tell them about policy, really try and lead them in a policy debate.
Complaining about the direction and the instantaneous nature of media is a little bit like complaining about the weather. Makes you feel good, but it's futile. You know, I don't think that we can say, look, could everyone just please slow down a little bit, because we need a bit of time to think, because we want to get this policy right, and if everyone could just shut up while we think about it. It's just not going to happen, is it? Because the media is relentless, and social media is relentless.
Television news is relentless. That dynamic tension between media and politics works up to a point. But can television hold to its promise to change the way we see the world and the way it works?
I think things are changing so rapidly, it's hard to predict how far they're going to go, but they've gone a long way already and very quickly.
Newspapers now are on the decline. As they decline, I think newspapers and their presentation are becoming a bit more shrill.
The tone and quality of our political debate in the media and from our politicians will improve and is improving. I think some of that is to do with the fact that we are coming to grips with the very many platforms that are there now for information, and they're starting to work together more.
Well, I think the first thing politicians should do is not fall into the temptation of wanting to be in the daily media cycle for its own sake. The best advice I'd give people on that is go into the cycle when you've got something to say.
And as that happens, the social media becomes more important. That's not necessarily a bad thing. This is a chance for people to empower themselves and to start saying, now, I'm going to be more discerning. I'm going to go and get the news where I want to get it, and I'll go and look for what I want. And in the end, they'll make up their own minds.
While people are interested in choosing their own news, if you like, and what they're interested in and what they're not interested in, I think there's still a huge market for people who are interested in having somebody filter through all the chaff and find out the stuff that they really need to know. And I think that's what television does best. I think a minute 30 news story with great pictures is still the best way for people to get their news.
I think we are going to see more complexity in our coverage, in our analysis, and in the debate we can have as a nation on really quite complex issues. We've got complex issues coming our way to be dealt with, and I think we are going to be able to deal with those, as I say, with more complexity, and I hope more thought, and I hope with more consideration all round.
Statisticians now commend me to a single man. The figures prove beyond a doubt the kindness of my plan. More men are killed on roads than in the whole of South Vietnam, so my comment lingers